Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. It's my pleasure to represent the task force in giving you an overview that represents our work over the last 16 months. This evening we have an agenda in terms of how we will proceed. First of all, we'll tell you a little bit about the process of the task force, the context of our mandate, what is happening in terms of citizenship by investment in the region and around the world. Very importantly, we'll talk about the security features of this initiative in terms of due diligence, what the task force has done thus far in terms of reaching out to our major international partners with regard to this initiative. Mr. Hill will speak about the highlights of the Antiguan legislation. We'll also discuss the Citizenship by Investment Unit, which is the unit that will administer the program. And then we also talk about the economic impact of the CIP, the National Development Fund, and then we'll take your questions and answers. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about the process of the task force. Very importantly, for an initiative like this, the task force consists of all Antiguans. And we believe this is very important. This was very important. So when we approach this initiative, of course, we approach it from the perspective of the interest of Antiguans and Barbudans. And of course, we know everyone, the concern on most persons' mind, of course, is the issue of the integrity of the Antigua and Barbuda passport. And of course, being Antiguans, this was something we gave very strong consideration to. We also must say that this process proceeded with no political interference. We didn't have any interference from the government. We didn't have any interference from the opposition. In fact, rather uniquely, we were able to sit down with members of the government and, of course, the opposition to discuss this particular policy initiative. So this particular initiative has been discussed with both sides, and both of them have had an input in terms of shaping the final outcome. I think we must also let you know at the onset that in terms of how the task force progressed, citizenship was not our first option. Because, of course, we will see today, we will discuss this evening the policy, but the issue of citizenship was not something we defaulted to. In fact, if I can remember, I think we spent about 3 months debating that particular issue with regard to citizenship versus residency, because it was a very personal issue to us. And so this is really the backdrop to what we will share with you this evening. In terms of the terms of reference, the task force has some terms of reference which was given to it by the Honorable Prime Minister. And this included to identify the best strategic option available to support investment and residential tourism. We also wanted to identify risks and necessary safeguards that should be in place to maintain the integrity of the Antigua and Barbuda passport, to examine the business benefits, of course, which would come from this initiative, and of course, to determine the legislative and regulatory amendments required to recommend course of action. I think as a task force, we have had a rather unique experience. Of course, Mr. Hill is the attorney on this core group, but all of us on the task force actually had a lot of input in shaping the legislation. So the legislation was not just given to a group of lawyers to do. The members of the task force scrutinized it several times. In fact, I think we would have seen about 3 or 4 drafts of the legislation before what we have arrived at. So the task force really gave it some very, very strong scrutiny. And of course, we also had to establish an institutional framework to manage the program. I would like to, at this time, introduce you to the members of the task force, because we are not the complete task force. We are just making the presentation tonight. The full task force consists of Ms. Sandra Joseph, who is the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Lieutenant Colonel Ivor Walker, who is in the Ministry of National Security, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Croft, who is Director of the Office of National Drug and Money Laundering Compliance Policy, Ms. Gay Heshmi, who is the CEO of Caribbean Developments Limited, Antigua, Mr. Arthur Thomas, who is the President of the Antigua and Barbuda Bar Association, of course, Fitzmaurice Christian, Mr. Hill, whom we've spoken about before, and Mr. Brian Dornellis of OBM International. So as you can see, in terms of representation on the task force, it represents varied background which are required for an initiative like this. So we had persons who were skilled in real estate development, in law, law enforcement, international relations, business development, because all of these, of course, help to shape what we have here today. And I must say, it has been a pleasure working with the members of the task force. We have had very, I would say, strong discussions, very strong and spirited discussions. And I think this task force should be commended for the sacrifice that the persons have made in terms of national service. I think that is outstanding, and it was our pleasure. Now, let's begin by giving our definition of what we mean by citizenship by investment. We would describe it as an economic and social development tool by which a country leverages its network of international relationships, physical and social attributes to attract resources for development. So this is really a development initiative, leveraging all of our years as a country, preceding independence and after independence, in terms of how we have conducted ourselves as a country. And by virtue of how we have conducted ourselves as a country, the country has gained various goodwill. And what we want to do with this initiative is to leverage that goodwill for the economic and social development of Antigua and Barbuda. Now you may ask, why citizenship by investment for Antigua? We believe this is a very important initiative to create revenue and support for social and economic development and local infrastructure. Many of us, of course, complain constantly about the state of the country's infrastructure, the issue with regard to our social services. So this was one of the major considerations for this initiative. We also wanted to stimulate new investment opportunities for Antigua and Barbuda and to create new tax revenues and other forms of revenue. We also wanted to create sustainable economic activities designed to improve the living standards of Antigua and Barbuda. Now we want to give you some further context, and the context we're going to give you really concerns the international or the external issues, and of course the internal issues that would have led us down this path. Now, in terms of the external, which we call the supply side, we all know that our development partners, the United States, UK, USA, all of these countries themselves are facing very serious economic challenges. For example, the UK is a part of the EU, and many countries in the EU are having serious debt issues. Even the United States has had its debt downgraded. So all our development partners are also facing some serious economic challenges, which means, of course, that their first priority is to take care of their domestic issues. As a result, we have seen a decline in development assistance to developing countries. So in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, that has declined by 71%. Many of us here, I think I see many full-grown persons here. When we were teenagers, we would see projects, infrastructure projects, funded by the US government, funded by this government. But I think we can safely say, within the last several years, we have seen very few of those. And it's for the reasons that we have mentioned before. In terms of the issue of technical assistance because countries continue to give technical assistance. But before, whereas they would fund technical assistance 100%, now they are requiring the government of Antigua and governments like Antigua and Barbuda to also have an input in technical assistance. So even technical assistance itself is not 100% funded. Of course, we also know of the difficulty of governments in terms of accessing international credit. It has been a challenge for developed and developing countries to access credit. And of course, we are all familiar with the issue of Barbados in terms of the downgrading of their credit rating, which means that when Barbados borrows money in the international market, the rate of interest is going to be higher. And of course, we have many business persons in the audience. Businesses themselves have difficulty in terms of accessing credit. So that is the framework or the border, the international framework in terms of in which we operate today. On the demand side, or what we call the local side, we are also faced with challenges. So we have challenges externally in terms of the sources of funding, and the country itself has serious challenges. For example, maintaining our infrastructure, servicing very high historical debt. And we actually looked at the issue of our debt, and the issue of our debt is not a recent phenomenon. Antigua has had high debt for many years. So the issue of our debt really transcends political administrations or party administration. So debt has been high in the era of the ALP, and debt is high in the era of the UPP. So the issue of debt is not a political issue. It's a national issue. It's a national concern. Then, of course, we need to invest in our young people. We need to have access to finance for entrepreneurs, and we need to create jobs for our people. One of the major challenges that has been in the newspaper recently is the issue of social security. Because I think for a viable social security scheme, I think it needs to have a ratio of 8 or 9. For every 9 contributors, you have 1 pensioner. I think in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, it's down to 4 or 5, which is very critical for the long-term viability of the scheme. It was rather interesting to note in our research that this particular issue in terms of the viability of Social Security was something mentioned even back in 2002 by the International Labour Organization. So this is not a recent phenomenon. So what this initiative is seeking to address are long-standing challenges the country has faced. Of course, we want a greener environment, and of course, we want to increase the quality of our healthcare. Now, let's talk for a bit about what motivates persons to seek citizenship by investment. What we have found, it's basically 4 reasons. They're looking for convenience, the ability to enter visa-free, and whereas it is something that we take for granted, I think in terms of Antigua and Barbuda, in terms of countries, we are well over 140 countries, right? 127 countries we travel visa-free. There's also the issue of personal security, where persons are faced with instability at home. There's a tax planning advantage to it. And of course, very importantly, the issue of real estate investment in a second home. Now, we want to take a few minutes to look at the types of citizenship by investment programs that exist internationally and in the region. And you would be interested to know that the United States has a citizenship by investment program. In fact, under President Barack Obama, the United States has been rather even more aggressive with regard to their program because of the need to have investment in the United States. Australia, Canada is very aggressive, extremely aggressive in this particular area. The United Kingdom, Austria, and several other countries have citizenship by investment program or residency program. In the region, we have St. Kitts and Dominica. In fact, St. Kitts has the longest running program in the world. So St. Kitts actually preceded many of these developed countries. I think St. Kitts' program started in 1984. So this is a long-held program by St. Kitts. It's for economic development. There's a real estate component of US $400,000. There's a social development component called the SIDF that was designed to address the fallout when St. Kitts had to give up its concentration on the sugar industry. Dominica has one. In terms of the economic and social issues, they have not stated it. But very importantly, we want to note an exception with these programs is that these two programs in the Caribbean that we have studied, there is no residency requirement. Now let's look at what Antigua and Barbuda has in place. We have what we call a residency program, where persons who are going to reside in the country for a certain period, they must pay US $20,000 annually. They must maintain a home in Antigua and Barbuda. But in terms of its performance, it has had a very, very low take-up. It has not performed very well. So what we want to do this time is to look at what exists currently, the difference between what exists currently and what we are proposing. So the current system requires the person to make an investment annually of $20,000. What we are proposing with this initiative, because of the challenges that face the country, we cannot afford, there is not time in terms of the issues that the countries face for this to be done year by year by year. What we are saying with this particular initiative, bring forward that's something that would have been done over 10 or 20 years, do it today, so that the country has it today to plot its course forward. So that's one of the distinctions between what we are proposing and what currently exists. So whereas that would take 20 years or 10 years, this program will bring forward that decision to today. The effect and the benefits will be felt today going forward. And of course, I see a lot of businessmen in the audience, and they would know the value of having cash upfront. There is also the issue of due diligence, because this program has very little due diligence attached to it. The program we're proposing has international due diligence agencies, and Mr. Crawford will come and speak about our due diligence program later. In terms of the current system, there are no agents. Persons basically make the approach, and this program is housed in the Office of the Attorney General. So anybody can approach the Attorney General with regard to this particular initiative. But what we are saying, under the Citizenship by Investment program, you first have to be licensed by the Citizenship by Investment unit, which is, of course, a screening element. And of course, before you become an agent under this program, the agent themselves must undergo rigorous due diligence. So under this program that we are proposing, you must be licensed. So what we are saying here, for example, if Mr. Hill, if Via wants to become a citizen, of course he wouldn't qualify, but if Via wants to become a citizen under this program, under the existing program, he would go to the Attorney General's office. Under this program, he would have to go through an authorized agent. And this is a very important distinction. We have, under the proposed program, a dedicated and fully staffed Citizenship by Investment unit. And we think that this Citizenship by Investment unit is probably going to be the most heavily scrutinized government institution. It is going to be the most heavily scrutinized government institution. And so what we have proposed is, of course, it's going to be under the Prime Minister's office, so it's in terms of seniority of responsibility. Secondly, there's going to be a management oversight committee. And on top of that, the CIU also must report to a parliamentary oversight committee. So there are 3 levels of oversight with regard to this unit. I don't think any institution in Antigua is subject to as much oversight as this particular unit. And of course, you would understand that this is very important to us. and we believe it's also very important to the public. In terms of local land ownership, under the current program, there is no restriction, no control of where the person owns the land. Now, what we are proposing under this initiative is that citizenship by investment on the real estate side is confined to special areas. And there is a reason for this, because many years ago, when a lot of us were small, what we call the father of the nation made a very important decision. And to me, that's one of the decisions that sets Antigua apart from many nations in the Caribbean, where a decision was made to get a loan, I think, from Royal Bank to purchase all the lands owned by the sugar estates, because he felt that every Antiguan should have an opportunity to own what we call a piece of the rock. And by virtue of that decision, everybody in Antigua who wants to own land has an opportunity, because the price of land is not beyond their means. And we believe that that is a legacy that must be preserved. So as a result, under this program, it only applies to what we call zoned areas. In terms of marketing, of course, this program is more proactive. The current one is reactive. And the current one only really deals with the issue of real estate. What we are proposing in terms of this initiative, we are looking at several issues. We're looking at social and economic development, health, education, sports, entrepreneurship, and infrastructure. And we'll explain a bit later in terms of the 4 options available. So let's talk about the proposed Antiguan model. First of all, it has a residency requirement where the person must be resident in Antigua for at least 15 days per year. Whereas in many other countries, there isn't an interviewing component. What we are proposing is that there's a risk-based approach. So we only interview what we consider above-risk individuals. Many countries which have a citizenship by investment program, including developed countries, have no interviewing component. And so this is, as you see, a very important safeguard that we have included in this program. We also are requiring that persons who come through the process, who are successful in the process, they must come to Antigua to collect their passport and pledge allegiance. And of course, they have no automatic voting right. Now, a few minutes ago, I spoke to you about the issue of the different components. So I want to go through those components in details in terms of the focus areas. First of all, there is what we call a financial component with regard to what we call a charitable option. And this one requires the person must make an investment of $200,000 plus fees per person with regard to a charity. And charities, of course, the government has an official regime for charities where they must be registered with the attorney generals and so on. So this particular initiative, unlike other initiatives that has purely an economic component, it has a social component. So where a person wants to invest in a charity that focuses on health care and that sort of stuff, this initiative makes room for that. And the focus area is health, education, sports, youth development, and the environment. And of course, the control mechanism, and this is something that you will see in all the components. All of the components have some measure of a control mechanism to regulate the initiative. So in this particular case, it must be formally registered as a non-profit. So any club in Antigua cannot say they want to be a part of it. They must have structures, they must be formally registered, they must have a formal regime if they're going to be part of this initiative. Let's look at the real estate component. This would require that the person must invest at least US $400,000 in a tourism development. And of course, the focus area there is tourism. And as I said before, there is a dedicated area. That's one of the control mechanisms. And there is going to be an escrow arrangement because we want to safeguard the reputation of the citizen with regard to the developers. We don't want to have a case, because many of these persons are high net worth individuals who have the money to really stretch and take the government to task when real estate transactions don't work out. And so the escrow arrangement is designed to mitigate against that. Then we have what we call a business option. And the focus of the business option is really for investment outside of tourism. So we're not entirely focused on tourism. So if a person wants to invest, and in this particular case, the minimum investment for that project has to be $5 million US. It must be a non-tourism project. It can be government, or it can be a commercial project. It could be a joint venture between them and somebody. It could be anything non-tourism. But the important consideration with this is that although the project is $5 million in value, persons can acquire citizenship by investing amounts of $400,000 US or more in that particular project. So really and truly, we are providing an opportunity to invest in industries and business opportunities in public projects that are not tourism oriented. And the control mechanism there is that that particular project must be approved by the Antigua and Barbuda Investment Authority. The other component is what we call the National Development Fund. And if I must say, if somebody was to ask me what is probably the most important thing to this task force, we would say the National Development Fund. Because we believe the National Development Fund gives us an opportunity to invest in an orderly way in the economic development of Antigua and Barbuda. So the financial component of that fund is US $200,000 plus fees. And the focus areas for this is tourism, the public sector projects, infrastructure, very importantly, entrepreneurship, because we know one of the things that entrepreneurs in Antigua complain a lot about is access to finance and so on. We believe that this fund can help to provide access to finance, but also very importantly, we believe this fund can be used to give us the next generation of entrepreneurs in Antigua and Barbuda. And of course, very importantly, the final issue, this particular fund must focus on diversifying the economy. So what we're saying with this fund, we want to invest in projects and business opportunities outside of tourism to build other pillars of the economy. In terms of the control mechanism, this fund will be managed by an independent board. It has a confined, a very limited purpose, and it has what we call special fund status with regard to the government. So this fund does not go into it's not a part of the consolidated fund. Right? This is very importantly, because many of us have fears in terms of when things like this go into the consolidated fund in terms of what it is used for. Based on the Finance Administration Act, there are provisions for establishing what we call special funds. So this will be what we call a special fund. And we have had discussions in terms of the legal arrangement. There have been discussions about making it a trust and so on, because the idea is that this fund must be used for a very special and controlled purpose. This is not a fund, as far as we're concerned, to pay government expenses. This is a fund to invest in economic opportunities that will develop the country. So in a nutshell, this is really what we have discussed in terms of this is a basic outline of the citizenship by investment policy.